I want to thank everyone for coming to the Thompson Free Library's event with Chris Packard, the author of Mythical Creatures of Maine. Chris now lives in Hamden. He's an educator and he has a passion for the outdoors and storytelling, which has led perfectly to this book that we're going to talk about today. His great-great-grandfather founded what later became known as Packard's Camp at Packard's Landing on Sebec Lake. And in this book, Chris combines tales passed down through his family over the years and others from around the state in a book that combines cryptozoology, storytelling, and oral history into one of the most entertaining ways I've ever seen. The book's out now. We have it in the library, and you can pick it up at your local bookstore or anywhere else books are sold. So Chris, thanks for coming, and take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. I really appreciate it. It's so great to see so many people have come out to the presentation. I'm gonna share my screen and show some slides because looking at me talking is exciting, but I think looking at pictures of that illustrate what we're after is even more exciting. So you should still see my my talking head up in the corner. And let me go ahead and hit share screen here. We'll see if I can. It's been a little minute since I've done a Zoom presentation. And there we go. Maybe, there we go. All right. So welcome everybody. My name's Christopher Packard, as you probably know. And I recently published a new book called Mythical Creatures of Maine. It came out September 1st from Down East Books, and it's a field guide to the creatures that live in Maine and populate the stories of our folklore. And it attempts to sort of catalog every creature that has ever been talked about in Maine, though that's of course impossible. So the ones that are the most widespread, but across cultures, all the way from prehistory, the Wabanaki people, the first people who are native to this land, all the way to modern people who are still telling some of these stories, and cryptozoological creatures like Bigfoot, with a heavy focus of sailor folklore and lumberjacks and guides that have sort of made their way and been shared by people throughout Maine's great history. And I think one of the great things about Maine is it does have a great history of storytelling. And so let me tell you a little bit about something about me so that you can understand like how I came to write this book. So who am I? Well, I love to be outside, as John said. So I love to paddle and I love to trail run. I paddled the Allagash this summer with my son. We visited the ghost trains that you can see there on the left side of your screen up on Eagle Lake. And that was a 7-day trip. I love to hunt. I like to fish, and I'm an avid trail runner. I've logged over 600 miles of trail in Maine this year, and a lot of it right here in Piscataquis County, where many of you guys are, and the Thompson Free Library is. And so this is me on top of a mountain, and I think it's really important that if you're going to understand the folklore and the stories about creatures in Maine, you really need to understand about the people who actually tell these stories. And so these people who have been telling these stories really, and telling the stories of the spirits of Maine land, have spent most of their lives outside, and they know what it's like to be in the elements, and they know what the animals and the plants and the creatures are. And so spending your time outside is a great way to get familiar with the setting for how these creatures actually populate the world that we live in, and how they come to exist in folklore and cultural stories and the real world in a way. So also who I am is I'm a scientist by training. So I was actually a trained botanist. It's a plant biologist. And before that, I was a wildlife biologist. I'm also a homesteader. I have a little 4-acre homestead. We raise a lot of our own meat. Here's me butchering some chickens in the, on the table this past fall. And we grow a lot of food, so I'm a very practical person. And professionally, I spend most of my time being a science teacher. And that's a picture of me holding a stuffed pancreas there in my classroom. And I'm a biology teacher. So I spend all day, like most of, a lot of my waking hours, teaching and talking about evidence-based thinking and about biology and the secrets of life and the way we've discovered it through experimentation, observation, and repeatable procedures. And then I write a book about mythical creatures. And the irony on that for me is not exactly lost, but I think it fits in well. And I think you'll agree, like how does a scientist, a person who's trained as a scientist, come to write a book about mythical creatures of Maine? And so mythical creatures are, when we say mythical, I think it's important to remember that we don't mean like myth as in like fake or false. We mean myth like as in a fixture of culture, as in a fundamental way of viewing the world, as in, you know, a cornerstone of culture. And so to me, I take off my hat of biologist and I put on my hat of folklorist or anthropologist, somebody who's interested in culture, who's interested in community. And it really starts with sort of my family. So my family founded Packard's Camps back in 1884 on the west end of Sebec Lake in Willimantic, Maine. And this older gentleman here carrying the basket there is my great-great-grandfather, Burton Mulbro Packard. And he worked at the spool factory in Willimantic, and he slowly acquired and built up wealth there, and bought a store and ultimately bought the Packard's Camps, which would become sporting camps and also lodging for local workers when Willimantic was a boom town. Today, it's only a town of just over 100 people. And it also had a store, and he interacted with people who worked outside all the time. And in fact, he himself was a lumber foreman, a lumberjack, if you will, though they called them woodsmen at the time back in the 1800s. And he tried that, and he tried some investments in seafaring, and he even tried his hand out west with a horse and a pistol, but that didn't end so well. And he ended up back in Maine at the spool factory and acquired this. And so he spent much of his life talking to the people who would have known and told about a lot of these fantastic stories. Back when people had more time to be outside, back in the 1800s, where the best roads were the railroads and the rivers and the waters. And that was the way to get around. And people spent their days working, living, and telling stories together and sharing their knowledge and sharing their interesting stories that they'd acquired throughout history with each other, both to build community, teach lessons, and share about some of these fantastic creatures. So these stories came down to me, I presume, through my great-great-grandfather, because I heard a lot of the stories about mythical creatures growing up, spending my summers running around in the woods and the shores of Sebec Lake and the surrounding area with my grandfather, Mulbro Packard. And he would tell me stories about fantastic creatures such as freshwater tree squeaks and side hill gougers and wedge ledge chompers and all sorts of things like that. And these are sort of a really fascinating class of creatures, and they're a little bit humorous. And, as a kid, I was like, whoa, these are amazing. And I would look for him, and I enjoyed his stories, and I'd ask him to tell me about those. My father knew these stories, and my uncles knew these stories, and my cousins. And, and then I grew up and I started to study science, and I was like, I don't think these are real because they're not in the science books, right? So I was like, maybe he's just making these up, because he was, and as many Maine guides and woodsmen are, great storytellers, right? And he loved a good story, and maybe somebody like that as well. And so I just assumed he just kind of made that up. But a little bit later in life, once I'd moved to Maine full-time right here just outside of Bangor, I'm in Hamden, and I teach high school in Bangor High. I picked up this book at a thrift store called New England Folklore, and I started reading about some of these creatures that my grandfather had talked about. And I said, whoa, that's amazing. Like, these creatures were not a figment of my grandfather's imagination. People have been telling these stories, before he was alive. And so then, like a scientist, I was like, I got to collect all these stories. I want to find out more. Like, what parts don't I know? Did I not hear about? Have I forgotten? And I would hear some of these stories from other people who knew these, who spent time out in the woods. And, I just started writing them down. And it just became a little bit, my wife might describe it as an obsession, to sort of catalog these things as I collected them from people and old books and old newspapers, journal articles, the anthropological record. And I started to see that it wasn't just these guide and lumberjack creatures, they wove in with the Wabanaki creatures and French Canadian settlers who came into the area. And all these people worked together, lived together back in the 1800s and early 1900s, back when lumbering was in full boom and Bangor was one of the richest per capita cities in the whole country, all because of the lumber and outdoor industries. And so these people, they shared the stories, and as cultures do, they blended together. And it didn't hurt my interest in these mythical creatures that, being a young person who was interested in science, I was also really interested in things like this, cryptozoological creatures like Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster. And as a young person, I thought it was amazing that there were these creatures that maybe existed and scientists were looking for, and they were these big, fascinating creatures. And so I loved the idea that there was more to discover than what you could find at just a field guide or a textbook, that there might be more out there. And that really spurred my interest to actually become a scientist and actually work as a professional scientist for some period of time, and then to later be a professional science teacher and teach people how to think like a scientist. And so the idea that there's this unknown, I think, is this basic human tendency that is really important to forming a relationship with nature and to really getting involved with it. And more importantly, perhaps, forming a relationship with other people, talking about and searching about and believing about these creatures together. So a lot of times people ask me, are these creatures real? Like, could these really exist? Well, as a biologist, we have certain standards for what it means to be real. And of course, that means we have biological material. We can test the DNA. We can look at the body. It can be repeated and verifiable by other people in the field. And so it becomes unquestionable. That's how our scientific process works today. That's how we understand real. But there are other classes of real. There are other things that actually might mean that they're real other than being scientifically real. Back in the 1800s, it would have been unbelievable that we had a phone that could actually, light up, and it was a flashlight and a calculator, and it had basically the sum of all human knowledge, and I could instantly send a message to anybody in the world. That would be unbelievable and unreal. Now, today, science has expanded to understand that we actually do have all of these invisible waves that can transmit this technology, and we can power things that just like float around in our hand. And that's a battery. It's everyday, it's ordinary. We know that stuff is real. We also know that things that are not tangible and tested by science are also real. Things like political boundaries, the stock market, political whatever, even the idea of, do we love our mom, right? And these are things that we take for granted as, of course they're real. Like, is money real? It's just a piece of paper. We all believe it's real. Is that stock that I trade online, maybe if I had any, is it really worth money? Do these corporations really have value? Well, we all agree they do. We maybe are retired on the fact that they do, and we get income from it. If we stop believing that they have value, that they're real, then our reality changes. The way that we actually perceive and interact with each other as a community and interact with the world would change. We take this stuff for granted. The idea that we're going to follow rules and laws, these are all cultural understandings. So we can also have this idea that we don't need scientific evidence for things to be real and for them to affect the way that we live our lives, and that we share what I like to call consensus reality, this idea that certain things are real and we accept their reality and we move on from there. So if you believe these creatures are real and you talk about them as if they're real and you live your life as if they're real, in a way, it doesn't make any difference whether they're biologically real. Additionally, maybe they just exist in a way that science can't actually test at the moment. The people who, know the world best, the people who have staked their lives living closest to the land, hunter-gatherer hunters, indigenous people, professional market hunters, lumberjacks, they stake their lives around the world on actually understanding, and here in Maine, on understanding like how nature works. Where's the game going to be? How does a bear behave? Where's, how do you find the fruit that's in season? When do you move from the seashore to the inland when the good hunting is going to be? When do the fish migrate up the river? They know all this. They have to know it or they're not going to survive. And these same people have a fundamental belief that creatures, that these things that we would classify as fantastic magical creatures that couldn't possibly exist, that they exist. And they talk about them to folklorists and anthropologists. And even today, people talk about them, to each other, just as if they were as real as a bear or a moose. So people believe in them. Do they believe in the freshwater tree squeak and the side hill gouger, these creatures that my grandfather talked about? Well, they may have. People talked about in a sense, they convey cultural importance. And so maybe they're not biologically real, but they actually do have belief by some people. I have a jackalope on my wall in my classroom. It's a taxidermy, it's a taxidermist's creation. It's a rabbit with horns taxidermied into it. And every year I have students, top level students in honors and advanced placement classes. They come in and they're like, hey, is that where'd you get that real jackalope? That's amazing. And, so we think like nobody could possibly believe that some of these creatures that we ourselves don't believe in, are real, but maybe they actually do. Maybe we overestimate or misestimate what people actually know about nature. And a lot of lumberjacks and early immigrants were people who were not familiar with North America. People swore up and down that they worked with Paul Bunyan, one of the most legendary lumberjacks in the world. And, they'd be like, yeah, I used to be on a crew with them. And you couldn't convince them that they weren't, right? You couldn't get them to say that they weren't. So, in a sense, sometimes maybe people are telling stories, but maybe people are also do have some belief, and that's an important part of their relationship with nature. And their relationship with their community, that they have this understanding that these are things that we talk about that are real and that we treat as real. And so when we look at the deep history, when we look at culture, we have to understand that people did not think the way that we think today. And people in other cultures, like native cultures or even French culture, compared to like English descendant culture, they actually have different cultural understandings about how to interact, how they interact with the world, and the very nature of the world. Their language is fundamentally different, and it creates different understandings in the way that they see the world. And they pass that on. We pass on everything we believe about culture by sharing stories with each other and understandings, and we're constantly reinforcing with interactions with each other. But the most important ones, as far as creatures, are this idea of folklore. And there's myths, legends, tall tales, fairy tales. It doesn't matter what you call them. There's all these different flavors. What matters is that these are living traditions that people talk about and share about their actual experiences that exist to them, that they truly believe in. Even if you don't believe in them, I would encourage you to always listen to people telling their story. And, don't tell them it's not true. Like, you can if you want, maybe, if you think that would be helpful. But as a folklorist, as somebody who's collecting stories, I always say I have to put away my science hat. And I want to hear the cultural hat. I want to hear what is it that you actually understand to be important about this story that you're telling me. And so I don't require proof for stories to be real. And I encourage you to suspend your disbelief or to just be open to the possibility that things exist in ways that we, or each of us individually, might not actually accept. Right. And so, but that doesn't, we don't go and we don't go and say, I don't believe in the way that you view this world like that. Maybe we do. We actually spend a lot of time arguing, but we'd be a lot happier maybe if we didn't, if we actually listen to each other and just, listen to these stories. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is, why does every culture actually have similar creatures? One of the things that my grandfather would talk about, and other people that I've met on Sebec Lake, is these floating orbs of light. And around the world, they're called will-o'-the-wisp in English, and they are these little floating lights that move through the woods or across water. Sometimes they're called St. Elmo's fire if you're a sailor, and they can lead you astray. They might look like a lantern, or they can chase you, and nobody really knows what they are, but lots of people report seeing them. In French culture, they call them the fées follets, and in Wabanaki culture, they have name for them as well. And so Thoreau saw some glowing fungus in the woods in his book, The Maine Woods, that Thoreau wrote when he visited Maine, Henry David Thoreau, and he saw these glowing fungus in the woods, and he asked his Wabanaki guide, Joe Polis. He said, I've heard stories about these lights that people see in the woods. And he said, I call them will-o'-the-wisp. And, do your people have those? And so his guide there says, yeah, of course we do. They go through the trees, they make a sound, and he had some names for them that were various things that could have a function like that. So why is it that we have these same creatures that we observe and we hear in stories told about by people who are farmers, who are herders, who are hunters, who are fishermen, who live closest to the land, whose lives depend on it? They tell the same stories of little people, of monsters, of mermaids, of great serpents, and of floating lights in the forest. Maybe it's coincidence, and maybe there's something important there. Maybe there's something important about these stories that we tell that actually tells us something about the world, and maybe the way that we should relate with the world. Because a lot of times these stories include cultural prohibitions to actually tell us that we should interact in a way that's like a good relationship with the world around us. So when I did my research, I looked into the deep history, and I talked to people, and I heard people telling stories about these creatures, and I had lots of great conversations. But I also searched the anthropological record. Folklorists who lived 100 or almost 200 years ago sometimes had written down stories and conversations that they'd heard, things that maybe we don't have access to anymore, because one of the things about culture and oral tradition is they change. So there's a whole collection of books. And so I looked at over 100 scholarly resources, books, articles, journals, from folklorists to modern writers and cryptozoologists. And I collected the stories and the information and tried to put them all together to make sense and connect and talk about the way that the cultures that have made Maine their home for all of history have sort of worked together. So that's sort of the way that I went about this. But let's get to the good stuff. Let's talk about the creatures. So one of the most important creatures that's found in Maine folklore and even New England folklore that's often told about is actually sea serpents. And so you may not know, and of course there aren't too many sea serpents in Piscataquis County up by the Thompson Free Library, but down here on the Penobscot and all the way down to Cape Ann by Boston in Massachusetts was the densest sea serpent sighting concentration of anywhere in the world. There's over 200 sightings by different people of these creatures that had this sensoidal body, this undulating body. They would hold their head up above the water, and they could be seen being 50 to 100 feet long. And there's stories dating all the way back to the 1600s. And some people report things, that there were fishermen that were visiting the area even beforehand, talking about these sea serpents that were there. Now, the stories have dropped off in the mid to early 1900s, but they are important because they were so widespread, and they're all pretty consistent. And some of these stories are told by, or some of these accounts are told by some of the most reliable people that you can imagine. Medal of Honor winners who are brigadier generals and famous military. General Preble are people who talked about these sea serpents. In Portland, they sometimes call this mysterious creature Cassie. And so even though people haven't reported him recently, that's an important thing. And so this is an 1800s drawing of that sea serpent in front of a place called Egg Rock, which is right outside of Lynn, Massachusetts. And there was a huge series of sightings in that area back then. So this is, and so often what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a historic image, and then I'm going to show an image that I think is a beautiful image by Dan Kirchhoff, the illustrator hired by Down East. He lives in Belfast, who did pen and ink drawings based on my descriptions of the creatures, and so also historical images that he had access to. So this is his version of the sea serpent, and it always has this undulating, almost like leech-like movement where its body moves up and down, not usually back and forth like a snake, and it would stick up, and like you would see these humps that were the size of like a big hogshead barrel or a garbage bag in our modern day terms. And they were usually pretty harmless, which was nice because a big creature like that could cause trouble, but they were frequently seen. And people have lots of hypotheses about this creature, still being alive and why we don't see them around. And maybe it's overfishing. Maybe it's mechanized boats that have scared them away. I don't know. But before that, even the original people that lived here, the people whose territory this traditionally was the Wabanaki Confederacy. Furthest north in purple were the Micmac or the Mi'kmaq people. In light blue is the Maliseet going across the top of Maine. And then in the brown there, we have the Passamaquoddy people, and then in Penobscot Bay, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but in the Penobscot Bay and going up in the Penobscot watershed, and including the area of Dover and Sebec Lake is the traditional homeland of the Penobscot people. And of course, these people are all still here. And then there's the Abenaki people, which is a group of related people who speak a language closely related to the Penobscot language. And they've mostly, there's no official recognized tribal lands in these areas. They're up in Canada today. And so these Wabanaki nations have related languages, these 5 nations, and they tell stories of these fantastic creatures, which would later sometimes be related to the lumberjack creatures and the guide creatures and even the French creatures. But they're the people who were first sort of in relationship with the land and understood the creatures and the spirits that lived here. And they would talk about them and they do talk about them because they're still alive today. People are members of this nation, live here, of course, and I've talked to many of them. And they talk about some of these creatures still being around today, just like any other creature, that they're real, right? And so one that we're often very familiar with, and we're going to go through a few of these before we move on to another one. So one that is pretty familiar to a lot of people is Pamola. And Pamola gets lots of stories told about him. And he's this great winged spirit that lives, sort of a demon or bad monster that lives on top of Mount Katahdin. And the Wabanaki people had a prohibition against climbing Mount Katahdin, the tallest mountain. And one of the tallest peaks on the end of Knife's Edge is called Pamola Peak. It's named after Pamola in honor of where he lived, at least in the summer. And we tell a lot of stories about Pamola even today. And most of those stories that we hear, and probably the most familiar version of Pamola is this guy, is this version where he's got like a moose's head, but a beak, and then, these big talons, big wings, and kind of a humanoid body. And you can see that he looks kind of friendly, though still pretty formidable. And he's hanging out with this guide, and that gentleman's name is Leroy Dudley. And he lived on Katahdin and guided people up. And he told lots and lots of stories to the people who visited Katahdin, his version of about Pamola. But it's quite different than the native people's version where, he would help guide people up Katahdin, but native people didn't climb Mount Katahdin for fear of this creature that would actually carry you away, kill you, eat you, take you to the land of the night air, Alumikik, and you would never be seen again until 1804 when people led, Charles Turner led an expedition up the mountain and had 2 Wabanaki guides or Penobscot guides who actually led him up to the top. And they refused to go any further when they got to tree line until he was like insistent that like, well, we're going to go ahead because we can see the peak is right there. And they're like, well, you're never going to come back. And if you hear any weird sounds or, see anything, you better get out of there because, we know all these stories about people that never came back from up here. And so, their version, this is a cover of a book written by Joseph Bruchak, who's a famous modern Abenaki storyteller. And he's got, his illustrator draws this ferocious, almost bat-like winged creature that lives up there and, certainly captures a much more dangerous appeal. without sort of that human look to them. In the earliest accounts, though, the way they did, the early Penobscot guides described it to Charles Turner was actually that this creature would, he had a human face and an eagle's body and was capable of picking up a moose even, or a human in his talons and flying away with it. So no mention of a moose head or a human body really. And so this captures it a little bit better, but the only historic image of Pamola is this guy. And so this is a drawing by Chief Erexis in 1775, and it's the only sort of like early drawing by a Wabanaki of what could be labeled as Pamola. And so he signed a treaty in this way to actually celebrate this centennial celebration of Orono, the city, which is of course right next to Old Town and the Penobscot Nation. And so a lot of other descriptions, aside from describing it as having a human face and an eagle body, is that actually has a huge head with a ginormous eye, ginormous wings, a beak, almost no body, only a heart, and long talons that could hang down and pick up a person. So the way I interpret this is that there's an eye with a beak that's shaped like an L. These are the two wings, and these are the talons coming down. And this is a person who's being held upside down. Here's his head with his two arms out, and Pamola's got him by his legs here. And so he's carrying him away through the air, just like the stories would tell. And so that's kind of interesting. Another one that people have heard about, that you might have heard about, is called Lunksus. And it often gets the epithet of Indian devil, because reportedly this was the only creature that Wabanaki hunters were actually scared of in the woods. And so the people who first met them said, well, these are people who live, in the woods, who depend and stake their lives on this. If they're scared of it, if this creature comes into their camps and steals their food and breaks their weapons and, sprays foul odor all over their camp, like, this is something to be avoided. And so today it's kind of been, a lot of people have no idea what this Lunksus Indian devil was. And even by the 1800s, lumberjacks would tell stories about Lunksus, but they wouldn't describe it like the Wabanaki did. Mostly they would describe it like a big cat. They had a great fear of these mountain lions who they were scared of. And even Thoreau talks about how the Lunksus, this Indian devil that his guide, Joe Polis, had told him about, was probably a cat. And there's a language barrier, right? So there's people who are like, don't speak English completely fluently, and they're talking to people who either don't speak Wabanaki languages at all or barely speak it. And so sometimes things are lost in tradition, because it's actually, what they're describing is not a mountain lion. And sometimes later stories even describe it as like a hairy hominid, like Bigfoot-like creature, but it's really nothing like that. And here's me on a trail run in the Katahdin Woods and Water next to Baxter State Park, the new national monument. And I'm on top of Lunksus Mountain, which is this scraggly, desolate mountain out in the woods. And there's also Lunksus camps and Lunksus lean-to and Lunksus pond out in that area. So that might be a good place to find a Lunksus. And so I'm giving my best Lunksus face, because it turns out what a Lunksus is lunk, or lox, is a trickster in some of the old sort of way back stories of Wabanaki sort of creation stories. And he's a trickster, and he's actually, the word actually translates to Wolverine. And so wolverines have been extinct in Maine even longer than mountain lions have, since the early 1800s. And they were very, very rare before that. These are creatures that are alive and well, kind of looks like a fisher that we might see in the woods today. It's in the weasel family, and they love to live in the deep snow. They have giant pads that they can run across the snow without breaking through. They're fierce and snarly, and they can scare a bear away from a kill, or a pack of wolves, and they can bite with their big jaws right through frozen bone of a moose with no trouble to get at the marrow in between. And they'll even hunt moose on their own, that they prefer to find kills themselves by hanging out in trees and dropping down onto a moose or a young deer and biting it in the neck to kill it, kind of like mountain lions do as well. And so this is just a case of sort of mistaken identity. And so we hear Lunksus and they describe it, oh, it's an Indian devil. And so there's a misunderstanding about what this creature actually is, but it's really just the modern, it's a Wabanaki word for wolverine, which is a creature that you wouldn't see around because it had been driven to extinction through trapping and hunting and, warming climates after the Ice Age over thousands of years. Now, well, the Wabanaki people are related to and speak a language that's in what's called the Algonquin cultural group. And so they're an Algonquin cultural group that shares stories about giants, little people, Wendigo, locally called the Chenu, water monsters, and mermaid-like beings with people who are in this language group and have maybe a common ancestry in the way back times. That are shared across these areas. And so it's interesting that these creatures are widespread throughout these cultural groups and into even neighboring cultural groups. And so you really can't talk about Wabanaki creatures without it mentioning at least the Glooskap, this magician giant who was an important transformer and is associated with Katahdin, the mountain, a very sacred place to the Wabanaki people, sort of the heart of Wabanaki land, the tallest mountain in the region, other than Mount Washington. And so Glooskap was an important transformer who sort of killed a lot of monsters and made the world safe for the Wabanaki people to live. But then he sort of went away, and in modern Wabanaki languages, which are these interesting languages that actually talk about things in a way that allows for transformations and size changes in their actual language, that it actually is a language that's changing, and it's almost like a verb-based language as opposed to English and European language, which tend to be noun-based languages. And I discuss that more in my book, but we don't really have time to talk about that today. But there's a whole series of giants who can transform and change shape. And some are quite helpful, like the Thunder Giant, who's shown here with hair the color of lightning, who can change his arms into wings and might be similar to more widespread native beliefs about thunderbirds. And then there's the stone giants, who are the spirits of the mountains, live in there. And so Katahdin is told about in native stories. And then there's ferocious sort of like, giants that are man-eaters, like the Kukwes, right here with the pack basket on and the fangs. And these are a race of beings that would hunt humans and would be, kind of dangerous. You wouldn't want to interact with them. There's stories in some Maliseet legends about headless giants that you could meet. And these are stories told by recent people. And there's also the last one, that blue guy we're going to talk about in a little bit, is a cannibal giant, which is a very important creature across the Algonquin cultural group that is most frequently called Wendigo, but in local areas it's known as Chenu or the Kiwak. Which is the Penobscot or Abenaki word. There's also these water creatures that were the arch enemies of the thunder giants, and they like to nothing more than to hunt them. And so this is a pecked or chipped petroglyph found on the Kennebec River, which is the river that flows out of Moosehead Lake as the outlet there. And this is on the Emden Ledge, and it's a creature. It's like a sea serpent. So you can see its head, and it has on the right side of the screen, and it has, and let's see if I can get like a little laser pointer here. I guess not. It actually has, a mouth and horns, and a horned serpent is kind of an important creature throughout Native and especially Algonquin cultural group stories. And it has this undulating body, but it's important to note that this is a river creature. It's a lake creature, and it has these two front legs and a back leg and a little pointed tail, and it's standing here on like a little rise in the ground or a wave or something like that. And so it's right in the river, and there's all sorts of stories about these great snakes that would, they would hypnotize women to lead their husbands to be devoured by these lake serpents, these Kitsi-atosis, and Kitsi is a prefix in Wabanaki languages that means great, and atosis just means snake, and the suffix cis means small, which means like not necessarily small in size, because we can see the snake is actually really big. So this is the great small snake, but it also indicates that it's like something that's here and not from like a mythic age. And so Lox is the Wolverine, and Loxus or Lonxus is the Wolverine that exists today. And so we've got these stories about these great serpents that would, interact with people and try and capture them. And there's stories about how people would see these big snakes, and there's more petroglyphs in the Machias River and the Machias Bay as well. And they would sun themselves on the surface of of rivers. And when you went to like pull your canoe over, you could actually disturb them and they could attack you. And so there's also lumberjack stories and stories in even Moosehead Lake, and lots of stories down east, like in the Machias Chain Lakes, about these lake serpents that have a similar undulating or snake-like movement through the water. And there's another creature that is always a horned serpent. This is the Weewillmaqua, and sometimes it gets translated as alligator, but of course there's no alligators in Maine. And sometimes it gets translated as dragon, but another use of the word Weewillmaqua which is a Passamaquoddy word or pronunciation, is to mean slug or snail. And so I like to imagine it not with an alligator mouth, but with like a slug's like rasping teeth. And it has these horns that were branched and had these magical powers that some of the giants would use to fight with. And you could summon these and people could transform into these in some of the stories. They also have a host of little people. This is Mickham West, who famous early folklorist Charles Leland calls the Robin Goodfellow or Puck. So sort of like a forest elf, tremendous speed, strong magical powers. They like to interact with people and make bargains, but you wouldn't want to get on their bad side because they would do all sorts of tricks and curses to you. And here's my artist's representation of them in fabulous clothing. Looks a little like a Keebler elf in there, the forest elves. And these are similar to creatures that have been told about in Europe. And here's another species of little people that you might find in Wabanaki lore and in even the smallest river, paddling their stone canoes, spending all their night shaping these little clay balls and shapes into things. And these are called the Managamasuk, and they have great big long faces and noses, and if they turn to face you, they're so narrow that their face almost disappears, and their nose is their whole face. And if you were to laugh at them, they would become really offended, and they would cause all sorts of trouble for you and flip your canoe over. And if you try and catch them, they can go underwater for any amount of time without having to come up to breathe. And so they're very difficult to catch. There's other species as well. This last one in front of the rock is a stone dwarf found in Micmac stories. And this is the Wicklamoodajed, who would actually live in there. And it was said that if, and they could be really helpful, but again, if you offend them or you mess with their homes, which are giant mountains, ledges, and rocks, they would actually come out and cause problems for you and do all sorts of tricks and curses to you. And it, could lead to your death. But sometimes they would invite like lost wanderers in. And if you went into their house, which they could open up the rock and you could go in with them, for you, only a day would pass as you enjoyed a meal with them and slept there. But then when you came out, years could have passed by and your whole family could have grown old. And that's very similar to fairy stories that we see in Europe. One of the most ferocious creatures, the ones mostly to be avoided, were these cannibal giants, the Wendigo, as they're popularly known in American culture, and were told about by lumberjacks. And they were so feared by French and Wabanaki and regular New England lumberjacks, the English-speaking lumberjacks, that they would avoid these forest pools. And these are creatures of ice and snow and greed. And you would try and avoid them at all costs. So much so that people would actually, where the lumberjacks would try and scare other lumberjacks out of the woods by actually wearing snowshoes, and they would coat them in a fur, and they'd walk through so that it looked like giant, like Bigfoot steps, like this ice giant, this cannibal giant. And you could tell that it was not something you'd want to encounter, that it was the Wendigo, because there would be a spot of blood right in the center, right in the ball of the foot. And so they would take a step, and then they would have some cow's blood or ox blood, and they would drop blood into the footprints. And if other lumberjacks saw it, they would be like, oh my gosh, there's a Wendigo, and they would actually leave and refuse to cut, and they wouldn't be in the area. And so these are old, you might be wondering where these old sort of looks like birch bark etchings are from. These are from the 1800s, and they're from a Passamaquoddy chief whose name is Toma Joseph. And he etched these to illustrate some of the classic stories, mythic stories of his people that talked about the Chenu, which we would call the Wendigo, and the lumberjacks called the Wendigo, or the Mikamwes, or the Kitsiatosis that we talked about. And so the Wendigo has a heart of ice, and they're a cannibal giant, but they're not a race of giants. They're people who have been cursed for some terrible sin, or out of committing these really horrible acts based in greed, and maybe they ate somebody, and they would be cursed. Their heart would turn to ice, and they would not be able to eat regular food. They would become cannibals themselves, and they would also become incredibly powerful and gain magical powers that could make them even more ferocious. They could change their size to become giants so that they could hunt humans, and they could break trees off, and they could hang humans that they caught from their belt just as if they were a snowshoe hare. And so they were very ferocious, and their screams could even deafen people, and they would have these great battles. And so these are stories, and so that talk about these ferocious creatures, and my artist has drawn them as sort of being blue and a creature of ice and snow, because you would really only encounter them in winter. And the thing about them is that they were always hungry. No matter how much they ate, the hungrier they became. So they were literally a creature of greed and starvation and endless hunger. And so there's important cultural lessons that can be drawn, as well as warnings about these creatures that are widespread and accepted as real and feared and to be avoided. And there's even modern psychological or psychology diagnosis called the Wendigo Syndrome, where we talk about people actually having this sort of regional madness that they get, where they, have this uncontrollable like rage and greed, and like even try to eat other people. And they get so hungry that they even chew their own lips off. And so, which is like horrible when you think about. And then we've got another set of another culture that comes into the area. Some of the first settlers were the Acadians in pink, who were French speakers, and they were displaced largely by English speakers that came into the area. But all the original European settlers in the area that interacted here first were the French Acadians, and then of course the Quebecois, and they would come down, and all of these people later moved throughout New England and even beyond, and later moved throughout these areas. And one of the creatures that they brought with them was this voracious, cursed creature called the Lugaru, which is spelled Loop-Garu, and is this creature that's a man-eater, and they can transform into a giant wolf or a wolf-like hybrid, and they would run around and they would attack people. And there was stories in the French countryside, about these same creatures, and they came and they were strongly associated with witchcraft. And so sometimes people would cast the Lugaru curse on themselves to allow them to transform into giant wolves or wolf human hybrids, and to exact revenge, or to get even with people. And sometimes they would be cursed for being cannibals or committing terrible sins, which to me sounds very similar to the Wendigo type creatures. And so it's interesting that we have these stories from Europe and these stories from the Americas, and of course they're different in detail, but there's these common themes within them. And so here's sort of this Lugaru story there's all these beautiful Lugaru stories that are like really scary about them hunting and stalking lumberjacks as they walked alone through the woods at night, which was something that you wouldn't want to do. And they would, if you ran from them, they would hunt you down and kill you. But if you let them catch you, they would maybe let you live, but maybe it would be worse than death. And sometimes there's stories about them like digging up dead bodies, and they eat the souls of the dead. And, so these are terrible creatures, and they're associated with witchcraft and very widespread. And of course, everybody who believed in these creatures. These were things that were, of course, real. And there's also the lutin, which is sort of the French equivalent of a leprechaun or a little house elf, like a brownie. And they would help you care for your farm and your homestead, and they'd help you keep it tidy. But if you didn't keep it tidy or you insulted them, they would actually cause all sorts of trouble. They would ride your horse at night and put it away all sweaty, and they would tie its mane into knots, and they would turn the meat in your soup to rocks and pebbles, and they would sew your pant legs shut at night while you were sleeping. And the only way to get rid of them, well, it was very difficult to get rid of them. But one thing that you could do is you could take, a bunch of peas, and you could throw them in the barn or on the floor in your house, and they would feel obliged to pick everyone up. And if you kept doing this every night, they would get so annoyed that eventually they would leave them there and they would leave. But no locked door could actually keep them out. Nothing could actually prevent them from coming for you. But they were generally helpful, and you would want to maintain a good relationship with these house elves, because they could, bring good weather, they could bring good luck. And often you would see them during the day. They would transform themselves into yellow dogs or black cats, or even white dogs, all sorts of these different creatures. And these farmers would keep them around, and sometimes they'd be living in their basement. But my favorite class of creatures, ones that, are range from being like really silly, almost jokey explanations of things, to being like these terrifying creatures that warn us about bad things that can happen in the lumber woods, are what folklorists call fearsome creatures of the lumber woods. These are the lumberjack creatures. These are the stories that my grandfather told me the guides and the sportsmen and fishermen still talk about today. Especially in areas like Dover and around Sebec Lake. And there's stories in Millinocket and all sorts that tell these stories of these creatures. And so here's a list of a bunch of names, things that you might heard of. And again, these are things that seem sometimes, these are like the Paul Bunyan-esque things. We think about them as like tall tales, yarns. These are just stories that we often think about that are not real. But again, these are things that people treated as if they were real. They too had little people. And so lumberjacks had these little people that they talked about, these little elves, which would come into the camps, and they would tie the chains into knots even while you were using them. They would open up, your logs that you were hauling, and there'd be like great cave-ins. They'd push the trees the wrong way. They'd break your axe handle. And there was one in particular that they called Sock Saunders. And so when things would go wrong, they'd say, you didn't get me that time, Sock Saunders, get behind me. And it was sort of like a little incantation that they would say in these lumber areas or in these lumber camps to sort of protect them from the antics of these little people. And if you think about like the Wabanaki forest elves, like they might not be too happy about people coming in and cutting down the forest. And so maybe they're things that came with the settlers, and maybe they're things that were there already, spirits that were not happy that people were there in the lumber woods. Now, this is one that's all but been forgotten, but it was one of the earliest and most important fearsome critters that if you walked around in the mid-1800s, in the heyday of the lumber ages, you would hear about the landlocked walrus. And so everybody would warn you that they could capsize your boat, they could attack you with their fangs, and they're smaller than their marine counterparts. You had to watch out for them. Their piston-like tongue can not only suck the flesh right out of a shellfish, but they can suck the flesh off your bones. So you want to watch out when you're in the water for these landlocked walrus. And you might have heard of the landlocked salmon, which is a glacial marine relic, a population that got trapped in Maine's freshwater lakes when the water was higher, as a biologist would tell us. But there's also these walruses that the lumberjacks knew about. And so people that would go into the woods, they would get these warnings, especially when they were up in the upper Penobscot watershed, these area that is today known as Chesuncook Lake. And they had lots of stories about great big cats that were ferocious. They were scared of mountain lions. Everybody knew that mountain lions were real. And they would talk about them being these huge beasts that would, like, their bellies would press into snow, and they could, they would step over these giant logs. And so they were these ferocious things, and they were really scared of them. But they were also scared of things called the Lucifer or the Lucifer, which are these ventriloquist cats, or the Silophe in French, which are this idea of a big black panther that could throw its voice, and that could actually make it sound like it was coming from in front of you, get you to turn around and walk back right towards it. It could scare you and create these great, like, sounds like a woman screaming ferociously in the woods, and it would feed almost on your fear as much as on hunting you, stalking you for almost an hour. The best advice, of course, was just to ignore these Lucifers or these Lucifer. And of course, interestingly, these Lucifer are creatures that my own great grandmother would talk about and say she really hated hearing about them. They would scare her when she was walking back from hunting at night. And the word Lucifer is actually a corruption of the French word, the actual word. If you Google translate what a lynx is, it actually translates to loup cervier, and loup is like loup, the werewolf. So it's wolf, and it means deer wolf. Cervi is deer. And so Lucifer is just a bad pronunciation. Interestingly, so this is like almost like a mistranslation, but then they also talk about Silophe, which is means of the fairy. And so these are cats that maybe are like the lynx, and they scare people, and they're real, right? And there's also the dingmal, or as my grandfather would call him, the Pelton Thumper, which was a large, thick-bodied creature that has a short neck, and it's a cat-like creature with a long tail, with a ball on the end of its tail that it could actually swing around, and it could break down trees. And it did this when it got scared. When the wind would blow, it would run in circles, and its tail would knock down and break trees, and it would break them up into little splinters, earning it the name of Splinter Cat sometimes, or Kindling Cat rather. Splinter Cat is a different creature. And so these guys, you also wouldn't want to make them happy. They're generally harmless. They just sit there on big open rocks. There's even a rock named after them in the presidential range on the Appalachian Trail in New Hampshire, called Dingmal Rock. But you wouldn't, if you came upon them just sort of like hanging out, sunning themselves on a rock, just like a cat would do, you wouldn't want to make them happy, because that also causes them to swing their tail around. And they also use their tail for mating purposes, that they can pound, the females can pound that big ball on the end of their tail right on a male, to actually, ensure that they've got a strong mate. You wouldn't want to have weak Pelton Thumpers that couldn't break up trees. There's also the bald-tailed cat. Now, this is a cat that's a big nocturnal panther that was also a skilled, vocal enthusiast, and it could cry and make the sounds of children or beautiful women, or sing or call you with your friend's voice, so that luring you out of your camp, your cabin, the bunkhouse. And as soon as you walked out, smack, it would hit you right in the head and knock you dead, and it would hunt you that way. And so there were these creatures that would call to you in the night, and you had to be aware of. And so there was also this idea of the unfortunate creature. And one of my favorites is the Kaput Bird, which is this guy over here on the left. And they made their home in the peaceful old growth pine forests, living up in the upper canopy. And the interesting thing about them, to make them unfortunate, is they have different sized wings. One wing is shorter than the other, which means whenever they fly in a circle. Now, in the peaceful old growth forest, no big deal. They just fly in a slow arc, land and adjust themselves, no big deal. But when disturbed, when the lumberjacks came, or hunters came to, walking through the woods, making all sorts of noise, it would actually scare them. And they would fly really fast. And since when they fly fast, it would cause them to fly in a tight circle, which would scare them, because they wouldn't get away from whatever was disturbing them. And they'd fly in a tighter circle, which would scare them even more. And they'd fly faster and tighter and faster and tighter, until kaput, their head would go right up their backside, and they'd fall down inside out onto the ground. It was tough to get a look at them. There was also the uneven-legged side-hill gouger, which is one of my grandfather's favorites that he would tell about. And he'd talk about how these guys were perfectly adapted to live on the hillsides because their right legs were shorter than their left legs, or their left legs were shorter than their right legs. They were right-handed and left-handed ones. And so they could keep their back exactly parallel with the ground, even while their feet were different lengths. And so that made them perfectly adapted to the hills, but very bad at evading anyone who would go to hunt them. The only thing you would need to do, because they could only walk in one direction, they couldn't turn around quickly. So if you jumped out in front of them on their trails that wrapped around the mountains, they would actually put their long legs on the uphill part and they would fall right over and roll down the mountain, and you could easily catch them. And so, you know, it's too bad that they weren't good eaten, because they were certainly easy to catch, and so easy to catch that we don't see them too much. So if you're ever walking up a mountain or up a hill and you see a trail going around the edge, it's probably the work of the side hill gouger. Now, another creature that rumor has it was good eaten was the Bildad. Now, this is a creature that's found only on one pond in Maine called Boundary Pond, and it's right on the border of Quebec in Beatty Township, one of the unorganized townships in Western Maine. And these guys are about the size of a beaver. They've got a hawk's bill, kind of a mixed up animal, because they've also got kangaroo legs, but they've got that beaver tail, and they spend most of their time sitting on a little outcrop here. And whenever they see a fish swim in front of them, they'll jump way out, up to 60 feet out into the water, and they'll hit it smack like a canoe paddle hitting the surface of the water. They'll stun the fish and they'll grab it, swim back, and eat it. So they were fairly easy to catch. You could tell where they were by their splashes. And so some lumberjacks got a hold of one of these fellas and brought him back to the cook at the camp. And the cook cooked him up in a nice savory slumgullion, which is a delicious stew. And Bill Murphy, one of the most famous lumberjacks in Maine, was the first one. You know, he had the biggest appetite of anyone in the camp. He was the first one to sit down, and he started eating this delicious stew with great gusto and delight, and talking about how good it was. And then all of a sudden he froze up and he let out a holler with glazed eyes, and he ran right out of the camp, and he jumped out in a seated position out into the lake, and as if he was a Bildad smacking a fish with his tail, except he wasn't. So he sunk clean out of view and was never seen from again, because he kind of froze up and drowned in the water. And after that, lumberjacks, even though they were delicious, never ate another Bildad. And they can still be found right out in Boundary Pond. And I love my artist's rendition of this guy. It's really beautiful, I think. And so another dangerous one is sort of like, it was this creature that's like almost like Maine's alligator, except it's a ferocious hunter, and it would catch lumberjacks, but it didn't have a mouth. But what it made up for in mouth, it had a great big nose, and it's called the Dunghaven Hooter because you could hear it snorting. And it would live in wet areas, and there's a lot of wet areas out in the woods, and it liked fresh clear cuts where there was a lot of green growth and pucker brush. You couldn't see the ground. You'd be walking through, wading through the pines, and the brush and the raspberries were getting you. But then these guys with their big heavy tail would see you coming, and they especially liked lumberjacks who smelled a little bit like rum or alcohol, and they'd knock them over with their heavy tail. And then, since they didn't have a mouth, the way they had to eat them was they'd pound them into a vaporous, bloody goo, leaving only their boots behind. And they'd turn around and they'd snort them right up their nose, inhaling them. And I think they enjoyed some of this rum that the lumberjacks often drank as well. So you always wanted to be careful walking through the pucker brush and the green growth out there to avoid the Dunghaven Hooter. Now, since they live in the thick brush, you rarely get a good look at them, but does look a little bit like a big alligator. Now, there's also the Widowmaker, also known as the Agropelter, who could drop on anybody who disturbed him or throw right at you, never missing a big dead log, a branch right out of a tree. So lumberjacks who disturbed him or leaned against the wrong tree could get brained right in the head with the falling logs. And they never miss. They're these tremendous, the people who did catch glimpses of these creatures described them as mean little apes with long whip-like arms who could hurl these big branches. And they never came to the ground, getting, only living in like owl and woodpecker, cavities, and enlarging them and chewing on the bark and the moss to get any moisture they need. So they're hard to track. And most people just call them widowmakers and think maybe it's a dead branch falling on you. But well-informed lumberjacks and guides, they know that it's the agripelter, and you got to keep your eyes up ahead of you. And sometimes when you're walking through the woods or, around at night, really anywhere, you get a sense that somebody's behind you. And you turn and you look and you don't see anything. Well, you know what? Something might be behind you. It might be the hide behind. And the hide behind is a fast and horrible, dangerous creature, but very shy. And they're so fast that when you turn around to look behind you, they spin with you, staying always behind you. And you turn the other way and they spin, always staying right behind you, hiding behind you. And they're also so fast that they can hide behind even the smallest tree. And these guys, they're so desperate for a meal that they've even come into cities, towns, and suburbs, and they'll climb into the car right behind you. So if you drive a Subaru, or you think, look back in the hatchback at night and you wonder, like, is somebody back there? Because you can't see. Well, you better watch out, because there might be a hide behind back there. So it sure is a good thing that they're so shy, because if you keep checking, they don't like to be seen. And also, it's tough to say what they look like, but you got to keep an eye out for those hide behinds. Now, it seems absurd that somebody could believe in some of these creatures, but when you think about people who didn't have much education, maybe spoke a slightly different language, and there's these real creatures like a porcupine, which is a cross between a pig and a monkey and a bear. It has no fear of a human. It rattles its teeth at you. And it can stand its quills, which are its hair and its soft coat, right up. And those quills are barbed and they'll stick right in you. Some people say that they inflate and they break off the barbs when you pull them out, causing infection, or penetrating, working their way deeper, even into your blood vessels and into your heart, killing you, getting into your joints, causing you forever pain. Or some people even think they can shoot their spines. Of course, they can't shoot their spines and their quills don't inflate, but they are this weird little creature with no fear, and their quills do work their way deeper into you and have barbs. And, sometimes they quill themselves and they seem to be immune to that. Their quills are, and one thing people often wonder is, how could you even be born if you had these sharp quills that might stick you? And so it turns out their quills are quite soft when they're born, but even just a couple hours after being born, they harden up. And even baby porcupines have that. So if these little tree climbing eat everything, they eat boots, they eat, axe handles, they eat, your barn, they're the scourge of anybody who's got a camp. If they've decided that they want a little bit of salt off of the footings of your camp, if that's real, why couldn't these other creatures be real? Right? And this one, of course, is verified by science. The other one's not so much. But if you live your life believing that they're real, fearing these creatures as if they're real, and they're real, you believe they're real, and you hear stories about the most respected people telling you about them, well, then they're real. And they're real in terms of having cultural information that we share with each other. They give you warnings about things that happen in the lumber woods. They give you warning. They bring the community together. So I encourage you to share your stories, whether it's the stories of the creatures, which some of which are in my book also, like Bigfoot and a big black dog called the Turner Beast, which haunts and attacks people and scares them down in the Lewiston, Auburn area in Turner, Maine, and other cryptids, UFOs, aliens, and ghosts. These are all things that people wholeheartedly believe in. They want to tell you their story. Maybe you have a story, and that story is important. Your belief is real. And if you live your life as if these creatures are real, then in a sense, no matter what a scientist says, they are real. And there's things that scientists don't know. There's things that we don't understand. The expanses of science are always expanding. Maybe there is a Bigfoot. As a biologist, I'll say there's no evidence that's conclusive that Bigfoot exists today, but people who've had experiences with these creatures, or with dogmen, which are kind of like the modern version of the Lugaru, the werewolf, those become real. And so that's what I've got to tell you today. And I encourage you to join me on the hunt and my trip through Maine folklore. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, where I'm always finding new stories, and I post those pretty frequently. And you can keep track of where I'll be and my new projects, and also learn some folklore and hear some of the stories that either didn't make it in the book or, just found out a little bit more and wanted to share with people. Book is published by Down East Books, so anywhere books are sold or right on my website at christopherpackard.com, you can get your own book. And if you send the people at the link, which is my local partner in Brewer, Maine, a message, I'll be happy to sign any book that you would buy from that link right there, which I don't sell, but it's from a store called Charmed and Brewer. So thanks for coming, and I would love to hear any questions or anything that you might have about this. So I'll let John sort of direct that.
Yeah, so I've just made it so that if you want to, you can unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can always put it in the chat if you're shy or you just don't want to talk, and Chris will be able to answer any questions we have.
Oh, the chat. Let's see what's going on in the chat.
So Estella said, excellent presentation, thank you. A couple people just said thanks, and Tom says, I wish we were sitting around a fire.
Oh,
I did have a question. So what was your favorite creature from the book and why?
Oh, John, I gotta say that's my least favorite question,
Oh,
because
sorry.
I love these like every one of these creatures I've like adopted as my own. They are like, every one has something absolutely fascinating about it. And I love the stories, the ones that have some of the best stories. And of course, I have a great soft spot in my heart for any story that my grandfather told. So the Side Hill Gouger and the Pelton Thumper and the Wedge Ledge Chomper, which can disguise itself as a just a boulder, and they move so slowly, but they're responsible for breaking rocks and scraping out stair-like formations in there. And they're mostly nocturnal, so you don't see them moving around, and they'll sort of settle into one place and always come back to it. So you might think it's a big boulder up on that ledge, but could be a wedge ledge chomper. And so I love that one. That was one that whenever we'd go hiking, I would wonder, is this boulder about to get up and start scraping around at rocks and living its secret life, and so that one was, definitely is one that, just always makes me think of my grandfather talking about those guys, and I can hear him, and I wish I had his amazing sort of Willimantic accent to really do the story justice. So I can just, it's just, that's lovely. So. Oh, it's not a cryptid, but can I talk about the Canadian water shrew I see in there? So one time a friend of mine and I were visiting with my grandfather as teens, and he would tell these ridiculous stories, but he also knew like everything about any animal in the woods. And one day he was talking about the Canadian water shrew, this little tiny voracious creature that could dive into the water, and it could swim around and like carry a bubble of air like on its backside, and actually kind of like carry a snorkel under there, and then it could it would catch fish and tadpoles and eat those. And shrews have to eat like for real, shrews have to eat like every couple hours, or they actually starve to death because their metabolism is so high. And so my friend and I actually assumed that he was just making up this Canadian water shrew, that there could be no such creature as like an aquatic, like hunting mouse-like creature. But it turns out that like Canadian water shrews are actual biological creatures. So the fact that like we don't know about nature, and what we don't know, and people who do spend so much time in nature, finally see things. Like I've seen one star-nosed mole in my whole life, and like they're like crazy looking, like they have these like tentacles on their nose and they crawl around underground. Like, I mean, that's amazing. And so like, and one of my favorites in the book, to get back to John's, is the snipe. And I think he posted about it on Facebook there, because every single student I have believes that a snipe is fake. you know, that it's something that you get sent on a snipe hunt and you're out holding the woods, you know, like a bag, a pillowcase and a stick and a whistle, and your friends are back there at camp, you know, flushing, you know, the snipe towards you, but they're actually, you know, they're actually just sitting there laughing at you, playing a trick. But it turns out a snipe is an animal that like lives, it's a bird that lives and breeds right here in Maine. And there's a hunting season for it, and they have a really cool lifestyle. And so, you know, that's a, you know, that's a real creature. And to the comment that somebody made about, I wish we were sitting around a fire, like this is my first time doing a Zoom presentation. So it's kind of hard because you know, we get this interaction with each other when we're together that is a little bit missing on Zoom. So I'm really happy that I can share this story. And I mean, there's like 30 or more people on here, and this is wonderful to get to share these stories. So I hope they came through on Zoom. I hope those stories still had that thing, but I too, Tom, wish that we were sitting around a fire trading stories. So it looks like, have I ever seen any of these creatures is a question. Is that okay, John, if I read the question?
Yeah. That's fine. I didn't know if you had the chat up or not.
One thing that I've seen that actually my grandfather has also would tell me about was these floating orbs of light. So right sitting on the dock one day with a friend, I was in my 20s. We were looking at the woods back towards camp. We're floating on Sebec Lake out on the dock, and you know, we're looking at stars and we're just chatting, and we look back towards the camp and there's these orbs of light, balls of light like the will-o'-the-wisp floating through the woods, you know, about, I don't know, 10 to 20 feet through the air. And there were two of them, and they just moved right through the woods. And we both were like, do you see that? And we both saw it. And like, you can believe that or not, but like, it definitely happened. Like that was a shared, like there was even somebody else there, which doesn't always happen. So I've seen that. And, you know, sometimes you get feelings in the woods or you hear inexplicable sounds. My science training has sadly made me very skeptical of everything. And so I'm always like really wanting verification. And, you know, it's amazing what we can convince ourselves is not a mysterious happening. Like that didn't really happen. Like it starts to feel like a dream, or like we come up with every explanation to make it go away. And if you don't know about these creatures, you don't even know what you're looking for. I've been hiking through the woods and like, you know, I'm like, look at that moose over there. And people are like, what moose? I don't see a moose, because they don't have like a search image for it. They don't know to look for it. And as a botanist, like I got paid for hundreds of hours just to wander around and look for rare plants. And, you know, like half the time I didn't find them, you know, way more than half the time, like 99% of the time I didn't find these rare endangered plants on these permits. And so there's stuff out there that, you know, and most people, they go out in the woods. And at one point when I was working as a botanist, I could identify, you know, probably close to 1,000 plants by site and scientific name and family. I mean, that was my job. And, other people, they go out there and they're like, look at all the brown and green stuff. That's a tree, and that's a tree, and that's a bush, and that's about as good as they get. And so you start to learn to recognize what's out there the more time you spend studying this stuff. And so, you know, that's why I arrange my book like a field guide. It's like a naturalist notebook. Where can you go? And I love Dan Kirchhoff's drawings where it looks like somebody was out there like sketching in a hurry. I got to get this down, you know, before it goes away from there. So, the Kaput Bird somebody talks about in the second edition. And actually the Kaput Bird is in the first edition. It's right in there. And I, in fact, got that story from who may also be my cousin, Jerry. So Tom mentions the Kaput Bird, and I just love that story. And if you do know Jerry Packard, who is the current manager of Sebec Lake, the Sebec Lake Packard's Camps, which is no longer a resort hotel. It's kind of like a condo association, but the old hotel and the old store, you know, for gum pickers and bear trappers is still there. And he knows some of these cool stories. And my grandfather lived right on the other side of Bucks Cove, and my father lives there for much of the year now with my mom, and they know these stories as well. So what else? Have you heard of any recent stories, possible sightings of these creatures in the local area? There's actually an amazing number of sightings of fantastic creatures, but like the last slide or the second to last slide in my presentation, they're mostly about things that are like Bigfoot, aliens, UFOs. You do hear sightings about local, like orbs of light, like the will-o'-the-wisp. Sometimes you'll hear people say they saw a fairy or a little person. And a lot of times people don't like to share these stories because people are very skeptical, and people can be, you might have noticed, a little mean when they disagree with you and think what you're saying is stupid. And, and it's your experience. It's what really happened to you. It's how you are in the world. And so I encourage you, tell your story and let people think what they will. That's not the thing that you can control. And so there are lots of reports, and there's actually kind of a fun Facebook group, if you're on there, called Unexplained Maine, where people will actually post about experiences they've had with, Bigfoot and, mysterious lights in the woods and UFOs and ghosts and things like that. And so, so yeah, there are definitely people still telling these stories, like these guide stories, the fearsome critter stories, and there's people having experiences with what they call dogmen today, but that's the Lugaru, the French werewolf. Though, to make it a little more cryptozoologically like palatable, more scientifically, we say, oh, it's just like, it's not a cursed like cannibal like witch who can transform shape. It's somebody, it's a race of dog people that actually can step into another dimension. And some people explain that's why we can't find Bigfoot that way. And, so people have all these hypotheses and ways of understanding the world and the way of thinking about it. And if you live your life, like they're real, then are they not real? I don't know. That's one of those imponderables that I encourage you to ponder on. Like, what does it mean to be real? Like, are stocks real? Like, it's weird. All right. Anything else in there, John, that I missed? Oh, nice.
Someone did ask, will there be a second edition?
And
I had a question that goes along with that. That's just, are there any creatures you didn't include that you wish you had now that the book is actually out?
I've heard about some more like French cultural boogeymen, like the 7 o'clock man. I forget the French pronunciation. And there's, these shadow people that people talk about that might be related to that one. And there's some interesting folklore about that. I did try to focus the book on what would be like creatures, like races of beings, or like a whole phenomenon, and not singular creatures. But sometimes they got in the book. One that I definitely wish was in there was the Gabi, and he's in the glossary. But I wish he'd gotten, which is a Canadian gray jay. And they come and they take food from you. And there's some amazing lumberjack stories about these guys like leading people back to their camps, and also cursing you because they're good luck. And if you kind of like the fairy folk, if you wrong these birds and don't give them food, or do pluck their feathers or attack them or kill them, they'll actually come back and curse you. And some people say that they're the spirits of past lumberjacks and hunters. And so the Gabi, I think, should have gotten his own entry. And I would encourage anyone who knows stories of their own or has anything to reach out to me. There's a contact form on my website at christopherpackard.com, or find me on Facebook, Christopher Packard, author, Mythical Creatures of Maine. It's all in the title there, so you can find me pretty easily. And send me a message, send me an email. And I'll get back to you. And I absolutely want to hear your story, and I want to keep these alive. And I think it's awesome if you know about things that I don't know, or different versions of the stories and way that I talk about in the creature. And these are stories that change, and oral tradition and culture evolves. If it stops evolving, then it's dying, right? And so our experience is fluid, and the way we view things right now might be a little bit different a little bit later in our lives. Like we can all think back to like maybe being a teenager, and the way we viewed the world was fundamentally different than the way we view the world at our current ages. You know, so I hope there'll be a second edition or a second, you know, like some other volume collecting interesting folklore stories and beliefs, important cultural beliefs of the people in Maine. And I have some ideas bouncing around, and I've been busy making lists of things, and sometimes lists lead to other books. So I'm pretty excited about that. So any cool story you have about stuff that's happened to you, I would love to hear it.
I think that's about it. I mean, I'm really blown away by the book. It's great. It combines so many things, like you were talking about: oral history, tradition, storytelling, nature, cryptozoology, which everyone knows I'm a big fan of. It's wonderful. It's at the library right now if you want to come check it out, or like I said, you can go on the website and purchase it. Chris, thanks for coming and talking to us today. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you for having me and organizing this. And I love being able to get these stories out, because if we don't tell them, they go away. These creatures go extinct. And actually, one of the cool things that people would say to me when I'd ask like an old guide or a family member, like, hey, do you know about this guy? They'd be like, well, I think they're extinct around here. And, you know, like, I don't think that one, you know, and so it's like treating it in that same way, because, you know, the way you tell these stories, even if you don't believe them, is you tell them true, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And on that note of getting the word out there, I'm recording this right now, and I'm going to be putting it up on YouTube. So if you missed any of this, or if you know someone who couldn't make it tonight, let them know that it'll be on YouTube and you can watch it later, so that even more people can hear about it. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks again, Chris, for coming and talking to us. It's been a great time, and have a good night, everyone. Bye.
See you, everybody.